The term gunfighter is used heavily in discussions of the Wild West. This is despite the word being used as a general phrase, meant to describe a number of professions on the western frontier. It could reference ranchers and cowboy archetypes that you see in artistic representations of the time period. It could also relate to polar opposites. Both lawmen and outlaws alike were forms of gunfighters, always armed and ready for a show, either for the greater good or the selfish bad. Even folks stuck with the labels of conman and gambler were referred to generally as gunfighters. Of all the professions spanning all the industries, the most fascinating subgroup of gunfighters was the bounty hunters, men dispatched by both the government and powerful entities to venture out across the land in search of wanted outlaws. While bounty hunting wasn't as popular a career as many Hollywood films would suggest, it was a way for some of the most experienced and isolated gunfighters to make a living, while using their talents to the best of their abilities. To cover these intriguing and incendiary figures of Western frontier lore, here's the next video in our series of both famous and infamous bounty hunters, continuing with the legendary railroad detective, who would later inspire various Hollywood movies, James Whispering Smith. The legend of Whispering Smith, Railroad Detective, began many years before his iconic, soft-spoken Southern drawl was heard by outlaws across the frontier. Rather, it began in 1838, when a boy called James L. Smith was born somewhere in the United States South. Smith's parents, childhood home, and upbringing in general are hard to pinpoint. It's widely believed that he grew up in a well-respected community with well-respected folks. Eventually, Smith entered adulthood and left to explore the rest of the United States as he saw fit. Like any young, molding mind of the expanding American frontier, he sought to venture west and explore the mysteries and mayhem of a developing, unpredictable land. By the time 1860 rolled around and Smith had a few years of excursion notched into his belt, he found both camaraderie and comfort on the Mississippi River. More specifically, he joined the growing parade of riverboats that housed gamblers and gunfighters seeking riches and refuge. Smith fell in line more with the latter group than the former, not equating to much of a gamester or poker player himself. However, he was no stranger to gunfighting, and certainly knew his way around a rifle or pistol after learning the ins and outs during his boyhood. One folktale alleges Smith took part in his first major gunfight on one of his riverboat gambling escapades. It said one night aboard the Belle of Memphis, Smith met the incendiary character called Larry Boyle. Boyle was a ferocious gambler, a hard-boiled personality, and didn't like hearing it when the cards didn't fall his way. On this specific losing streak, it just so happened Smith was there to take the brunt of the conflict. But when he'd had enough of the gambler's ramblings, Smith challenged Boyle to a duel. Both men were quick to the draw, but the boy from the South was deemed a winner, even though the fate of Larry Boyle was never clarified. After his gambling days aboard Mississippi riverboats came to a close, the Civil War broke out and a new calling was heard. Smith, hearkening back to his upbringing, felt it was in his best interests to fight alongside the Union Army. He held staunch anti-slavery beliefs and headed north to fight alongside other Union soldiers turned legends, such as Wild Bill Hickok. While they never shared the battlefield together, Smith was thrust into the action. Due to his experience on the riverfront, he was sent back to the Mississippi River to join the Union Navy. He was stationed aboard an ironclad and is thought to have assisted the transport of troops and artillery between northern territories and battalions swooping into the South. When his service time came to an end, Smith wasn't ready to return to civilian life and put his burgeoning sleuthing skills to good use. He was hired on by the Freedmen's Bureau as an official plantation inspector. The Freedmen's Bureau was initially formed as a governmental agency to supply former enslaved men, women, and children, alongside wartime refugees, with clothing, food, water, fuel, and temporary shelter. They also helped quell conflict between freedmen and white agitators, preventing race riots and potential lynchings. Smith's skill sets were better applied to the latter group, and he was put in charge of investigations. He traveled from plantation to plantation, interviewing former enslaved folks when crimes were perpetrated against them. This was dangerous work in the South, especially during Reconstruction, when hate groups and vigilante posses, such as the Ku Klux Klan, were looking to inflict maximum damage, or even death, against freedmen and the white populations that supported them. It was his time serving as a plantation inspector that led James L. Smith to the next phase of his bounty hunter career. From the Mississippi Delta, he traveled to the bayous of New Orleans, Louisiana, where he joined the recently created Metropolitan Police Force in 1868. For a few years, Smith made a name for himself as a detective in New Orleans. The town had been marked with violence and crime ever since the riot of 1866, specifically within the elections held throughout Reconstruction. Smith did his best to bring justice to the city parish, but wasn't without scandals himself. He was known to take in convicts and criminals, dead or alive, and would simply kill an elusive outlaw if he struggled bringing him in lawfully. On a few occasions, he was tried for his vigilante executions, but was always exonerated by a grand jury in the end. After an illegitimate shooting put the spotlight squarely on the detective's shoulders one time too many, he fled west with his wife to escape the suspicion and find new work. Out on the frontier, Mr. and Mrs. Smith settled in Omaha, Nebraska. It just so happened the Union Pacific Railroad, active in Omaha and beyond, was in desperate need of railway protection against the influx of outlaws, targeting the line and its increase in locomotives. Smith was the perfect man for the job, with an unmatched wit and confidence to put away even the most vile and vicious criminals. As was his inclination to skirt by the law, his superiors knew it, but turned the other cheek instead. Smith's aggression was of better use to them than legal pleasantries. It was the western frontier, after all. Over time, Smith's duties with the Union Pacific expanded, and he was dispatched to investigate crimes in Sidney, Nebraska, and even further north into regions such as the Black Hills. It was on these quests he acquired the nickname Whispering Smith. In the heat of an investigation, Smith was known for expertly using his soft southern drawl to communicate with allies. These conversations would occur in the thick of night as he and his men stalked their prey. It was always perfectly out of earshot to those they pursued, the bounty hunter cloaked by the whispers of the wind. By the time the thieves caught on, it was too late. The suave tracker got his man. Thus, Whispering Smith stuck, and he never looked back. Smith certainly wasn't without his controversies. On more than one occasion, Smith either shot his unarmed target without reason or lynched them completely. By the fourth offense, the Union Pacific had had enough of the bounty hunter's antics and terminated his contract as punishment. Still though, Whispering Smith couldn't resist his inclination to chase bad-uns across and around and every which way in between the frontier. It was as if he was addicted to the chase, magnetized to the inherent violence of collecting bounties on hardened outlaws. As a result, he found new detective work with another railway division operating a line between Nebraska and the Dakota Territory. In 1879, they hired him on as a bounty hunter, and by the spring, he was already assigned his first major case. The infamous outlaw gang known as the Pony Boys, headed by the notorious Doc Middleton, had returned to the hillsides of Nebraska. Doc was wanted for murder, and the rest of the boys were hunted down after years of rustling horses. Smith was put in charge of one of two posses, composed of various lawmen from around the state. For 10 days, Smith and company toured across the panhandle of Nebraska and along the Niobrara River. Despite many close calls and a few short-lived gunfights, Doc and the Pony Boys eluded the clutches of the Whisperer. Their good fortune would eventually run out though, when Smith finally wrangled the entire gang. This time, he was joined by a faction of the U.S. Army, led by none other than General George Crook and Officer William H. Llewellyn. They coaxed him into a faux peace council, dangling the promise of a pardon in front of him, like a carrot and a donkey. Doc took the bait too, and Smith was armed at the ready. He and his posse engaged in combat with the Pony Boys, killing 2 of them. One of the lawmen, called Hazen, was also injured, but in the end, Doc couldn't get away again. He was sent off to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where he was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. A year later, in 1880, a band of train robbers hit the Union Pacific Line in Sidney, Nebraska. Smith was brought back in to help track down the outlaws and reclaim the $125,000 worth of gold bullion snatched from the train car. A few lawmen of nearby settlements, who were paid off by the thieves themselves, concocted a plot that almost took the life of Whispering Smith. The bounty hunter would have none of it, though, and evaded a lynching before bringing the original train robbers to justice, successfully returning the gold to its rightful owners. The following year, Smith saw his tenure as a railroad detective come to a brief end. His contractor had had enough of his gunslinging shenanigans, and after yet another vigilante shooting, he was terminated completely. Still hungry to chase down outlaws, he sought even more detective work, this time as Chief of Indian Police on the Mescalero Indian Reservation of the New Mexico Territory. Smith's time as a Chief of Police was actually short-lived. While he helped keep raids to a minimum as the number of outlaws grew at Mescalero, the politics of detective work by both tribal leaders and the federal government forced the bounty hunter to seek work elsewhere for yet another time. On this occasion, Smith opted for more secretive work with the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. They hired him on as a stock detective, attracted to his in-depth work rounding up stock rustlers from around the frontier. Many of his escapades with the association were kept under wraps, the bounties void of any details made available to the public. This was in hopes to keep outlaws ignorant to their pursuers, the scent of their trails kept pure for bounty hunters such as Smith. Legend goes that one horse rustler slipped from the grip of Whispering Smith and swiftly fled south to Mexico. This particular thief had prior engagement with Smith too, having killed one of his fellow association detectives and closest friends. To ensure he wouldn't go without vengeance, Smith put up his own bounty contract for the thief. Many lone huntsmen took Smith up on his offer and retreated south of the border where the rustler was executed vigilante style. Word returned north back to the bounty hunter, and he paid the frontier assassin as promised by his contract. While with the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, Smith was also known for his assistance in fraudulent elections to aid the WSGA's objectives. Farmers from around Wyoming and Nebraska had successfully lobbied for a fence law to be put up on the local ballots, but the association would have none of it. To sway the vote, Smith was dispatched across both Nebraska and Wyoming in search of folk willing to move into the election districts on moment's notice. Enough of the locals moved, and the legislation faltered. Smith was rewarded handsomely by the WSGA. In 1887, blizzards had swept through the high plains of Nebraska, Wyoming, and the rest of the territory's rolling hills. The brutal winter, combined with financial instability of the stock industry, ended the association's need for a range detective. Smith was let go, and he had no other choice but return to the career that made him, railroad detective with the Northern Pacific Railway. From the Northern Pacific, Smith's prowess as a bounty hunter was recognized by the cattle king of Cheyenne, Wyoming, a man by the name of Alexander H. Swan. Swan had connected with Whispering Smith during his heyday with the WSGA, and had his own personal interests that could use the skill sets offered by the bounty hunter. Swan paid Smith off to leave the railroad once more, and instead take action against a former business partner. You see, the Cattle King had been in cahoots with the Shortline Railroad Corporation in Ogden, Utah, just a few years back, But his financial backing fell through when it was discovered one of his associates committed fraud and slipped away unscathed, with Swan's investment in tow. Swan then hired Smith to track down the associate, one John R. Middlemiss, who is said to have escaped further west into California. Smith did as he was bound and wrote various letters to lawmen both in Utah and the Golden State. Unfortunately for Smith, some of what he wrote in those letters wasn't truthful, and he was ultimately arrested for libel. He was found guilty, but his fines were paid off by Swan, and he was back in action in no time. In 1891, Smith shifted his focus from detective work to prospecting. He filed more than one claim on mineral deposits in Utah, and reaped the reward on a couple of them. Not long after, though, a motion was filed that the claims were actually belonging to a previous prospector, and Smith settled with the defendants outside of court. He then sold his leftover claims to the Pleasant Valley Coal Company in Castlegate, Utah. It's unsurprising, but the failure found in prospecting turned Smith back to police work, and he was once again hired as a detective with the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. It just so happened the Pleasant Valley Coal Company was one of their biggest and best patrons, and after Smith completed a few assignments on their behalf, was poached by the PVCC and hired on as their premier security officer. The timing couldn't have been more perfect either, as Castlegate was notorious for its growing gang of desperados and bandits seeking refuge in the area. The local law enforcement didn't help matters either, with corruption running rampant through the Carbon County Sheriff's Office. Word on the street was that the sheriff, Gus Donut, was paid off by a few of the major outlaws, and the hiring of stock rustler C.L. Gunplay Maxwell as deputy only heightened the suspicion. As a result, Smith's services were needed to oust Sheriff Donut, as his lack of policing was causing quite the headache for Pleasant Valley's business interests. The bounty hunter did enough to thrust Donut out of office, but the attorneys assigned to represent the corrupted sheriff would not make it easy on him. These two lawyers, J.W. Wharf and M.P. Braffett, went toe-to-toe with Whispering Smith on multiple occasions, taunting the bounty hunter with nasty verbal epithets, and constantly arguing whenever the trio met in public. The feud took a brief pause in April of 1897, when Smith teamed up with Cyrus Shores to investigate the robbery of a Pleasant Valley Coal Company payroll by none other than Butch Cassidy and Elsie Lay. The pair of bounty hunters failed to find the Wild Bunch goons, though, and returned to Castlegate empty-handed, much like other Butch Cassidy pursuers of the late 19th century. By the beginning of 1898, Smith was at wit's end and couldn't take a minute more of the attorney's humiliation. After running into each other at the Denver and Rio Grande Railway outpost in Price, Utah, Smith, Wharf, and Braffett engaged in a gunfight that saw both lawyers meet their maker. Smith was promptly arrested, tried for murder, and acquitted, but his time working for the Pleasant Valley Coal Company had come to an end. Smith's next stop was in Denver, Colorado, where the editor of a local newspaper had grown tired of the antics of the legendary Bat Masterson. Masterson had a reputation in Denver as that of a womanizer, fighting promoter, and overall scoundrel. For whatever reason, this grumpy editor had it out for the iconic gambler turned gunfighter and hired Smith as his muscle. Smith ended up confronting Masterson, but it became nothing more than a civil conversation dotted with discreet and subtle threats. Masterson had the upper hand in the end, and Smith decided to cool off in Buena Vista, Colorado, where he worked as a prison guard. At the ripe old age of 72, and with the twilight of his career hitting him, Whispering Smith rode out one last controversy before putting up his pistols for good. After shooting and murdering a prisoner who attempted to escape under the watch of Smith, the bounty hunter was relieved of his duties, left without employment. He returned to Denver in the aftermath, his physical health rapidly deteriorating. Smith was so desperate for health care, he went out of his way to commit petty crimes and land himself back into jail. He told the press that Denver County Jail was the only place he could get free medical care, and he'd be damned if he didn't. Tragically, Smith was too sick and feeble to make his final mark, and on August 27, 1914, he committed suicide after ingesting a large amount of lye. His body was taken away and buried in an unmarked grave at Riverside Cemetery. It's believed his plot can be found in Section 2, Lot 205, Block 12, and efforts are currently underway to place a Civil War veteran's headstone for his gravesite. In the meantime, we can only look back and marvel at the chaotic career of the charismatic Whispering Smith. His exploits have been morphed into countless entertainment, with novels and movies and television programs inspired by the bounty hunter's tales. While most of his story's truth has been lost to adaptation, his name both forgotten and changed over the course of a century's worth of folklore, James L. Smith won't be forgotten completely. As long as the real narrative is told, his legacy will last as long as the high plains themselves, lingering throughout the frontier and kept sacred within the whispering winds of the West.